Mississippi Born, Delta Raised is a podcast that focuses on the intersection of public health and social justice issues in the Mississippi Delta. Daphne Robinson, an attorney and public health professional, is your host. My father's first full-time teaching job after the Korean War was at Armstrong Elementary School in Greenville, Mississippi. At the time, it was a town of about 40,000 people located on the banks of the Mississippi River. Although it was only 3 hours away from his hometown in Haynesville, Louisiana, in those days it seemed like a lifetime away from his Louisiana roots. But he had 3 young boys and a wife, so he began the long journey to the Mississippi Delta in 1957. My brothers and my mother joined him in Greenville in 1958. Thank you for joining me, and welcome to the first episode of the podcast, Mississippi Born, Delta Raised. My name is Daphne Robinson, and I am your host. Like many others of my generation, I was born in 1966 in the segregated OB ward of what was then called General Hospital. It was only a few years ago that I discovered that hospitals in Mississippi were still segregated in 1966. This was 12 years after the Supreme Court declared segregation unconstitutional. I grew up on 8th Street, 1 block over from General Hospital, in a section of town called Brown's Addition. I attended public schools in the city of Greenville and later went on to attend Tougaloo College in Jackson. I eventually left the state to attend law school and began my practice. I've been an attorney for 25 plus years and a public health professional for the last 5 years. While preparing for this episode, I've been pondering the question of why I wanted to even start a podcast. Like many of you, I have traveled and lived in various places throughout the country. But there's something about the Mississippi Delta, isn't it? When I crossed the Mississippi River Bridge from Lake Village, Arkansas to Greenville, I can't explain it. I feel kind of this sense of place and belonging, a sense of relief even. It's as if a weight lifts from my shoulders and I can breathe deeply again. When I see that sign that says, "Welcome to Mississippi," I am proud to be a native of the Mississippi Delta. A place, although steeped in the historical legacy of racism and discrimination, it's also the epicenter of the civil rights movement and an example of power of the nonviolent resistance. But even before becoming a public health professional, I grew weary of reading national reports in education and healthcare and quality of life that ranked the state and the region either 48th, 49th, or 50th. Usually somewhere behind Louisiana and Arkansas, both states bordering the Mississippi Delta. A recent study by economists from Harvard University and the University of California at Berkeley concluded that of the 5 areas in the country that offer the least mobility for children in poverty, 3 of those counties are in the Mississippi Delta. The healthcare issues of the Delta cannot be separated from the economic, social, political, and racial factors that form the fabric of the area. In the 2nd Congressional District, which encompasses much of the Mississippi Delta, nearly 20% of the population is on food stamps. The rate of HIV diagnosis in the Mississippi Delta is the highest diagnosis rate of any non-metropolitan area outside of the U.S.-Mexico border. And although money has poured into the region from various sources, the disparities in health, education, employment, and quality of life continue to exist. Have you ever asked yourself why? Why are we always 48, 49, or 50 in these national rankings? I sure have asked myself why many times. So I decided that I wanted to create a safe space for you and I and other members of the Mississippi Delta diaspora to discuss the challenges and obstacles facing the Delta. while also celebrating fellow Mississippians who are tackling some of these pervasive, systemic, and intractable problems. Some of the issues that we tackle include the opioid crisis, the rate of violent crime in the Mississippi Delta, and the rate of domestic violence. These are just a few of the topics that we'll discuss. These conversations may be uncomfortable because it may require us to frankly discuss the historical vestiges of racism and poverty in the Delta. But while exploring these issues, I also want to get you involved in this conversation. Once a month, an episode will be dedicated to the topic I've always wondered. In that segment, we will discuss a question about the community that you have always wondered about, whether it's Leland or Hollandale or Eudora or Money, Mississippi. For instance, I mentioned I grew up in Brown's Addition in Greenville, and I've always wondered why it was called Brown's Addition. And guess what? I found out why. But you'll have to subscribe to Mississippi Born, Delta Raised to find out the answer to that question. Archimedes, a Greek philosopher, once said, "Give me a lever and a place to stand and I will move the earth." Most people focus on the lever in that story. But really, it's the power of the platform that he's standing on that's just as essential to make change. I hope you will join me on this podcasting platform to use our collective voices to move the earth to improve the Mississippi Delta. Hey, be sure to email me at daphne.robinson.jd@gmail.com. Send me your stories about how your family got to the Mississippi Delta. I'd love to highlight some of those in a future episode of the podcast. I can't wait to hear your stories. And finally, the next episode will air in February, and in that episode, we're going to discuss the history and the demographics of the Mississippi Delta, because I think it's important that we lay the proper foundation for our future discussions and examination of how we got to the state that we're in. I hope you'll join me. I know that you could be anywhere listening to one of 1,000 podcasts out there, but you've chosen to listen to me for these few minutes, and for that, I am extremely grateful. My name is Daphne Robinson, and I am Mississippi Born, Delta Raised.
This podcast is sponsored by the Center for Public Health and Justice. The Center for Public Health and Justice is a 501c3 nonprofit corporation. Its mission is to improve the public health and safety of communities in the Mississippi Delta. To learn more about our services, visit thecenterforpublichealthandjustice.org. This podcast has been a Deuce Vision production.